Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. Not kings or queens, not grand castles or bloody battles. No, tonight we're going to the fields, to the mud, to the life of the people who actually made the Tudor world turn, the peasants. The average, everyday, dirt under the nails, never get a day off, constantly hungry peasants of Tudor England. So, dim the lights, get your tea, maybe put your feet up somewhere uncomfortable but not too comfortable, because this isn't bedtime luxury. This is a slow journey into centuries-old mud. And yes, it will be sleepy. Let's float over to another world, a world where life was a constant struggle between the seasons, the landlords, and the stomach. Tudor peasants lived in a world without running water, without electricity, without Netflix. Instead, they had a few things: the church, their village, a small plot of land, and a lot of exhaustion. The village as a microcosm. The Tudor village was not a quaint picture postcard. Sure, maybe it looks nice in paintings with thatched roofs and timber frames, but for peasants, it was mostly cold in winter, hot in summer, and full of smells you'd probably rather not imagine. Houses were often just 1 or 2 rooms. Floors were bare earth. Furniture was minimal: a few stools, a table, maybe a bed made of straw, and a chest. Privacy wasn't a thing. Families shared beds. Sometimes multiple families shared a house, and everyone was aware when the neighbor had a cold. Hygiene, as we think of it, barely existed. Baths were rare. Washing was done in the nearest stream, and frankly, you were lucky if you had clean water to begin with. Wells could be contaminated, and water was carried in buckets by hand, often from far away. If you think that sounds tough, well, you'd be right. But life wasn't just hardship. There was a rhythm to it, and that rhythm was work. Work, work, work. A Tudor peasant's life was basically a cycle of seasons and chores. Spring meant plowing and sowing seeds. Summer meant weeding and harvesting. Autumn meant gathering and storing food. Winter meant eating what you had stored and praying there was enough. Work was brutal. Fields were plowed with heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen or horses. Hand tools were basic: hoes, sickles, scythes. Everything was done physically, without machinery. A peasant might work from sunrise until sunset. The concept of a day off was rare. Sundays were meant to be rest days, but for most peasants, it was just a slightly lighter day. They still had chores to do, animals to feed, fences to mend. They didn't exactly work for themselves either. Much of their labor went to the lord of the manor. That's the medieval version of a landlord, but with more power and less mercy. Peasants were obligated to work the lord's land for free for a certain number of days each week and pay rent in goods or coin. This was called the feudal system, and by the Tudor period, it was still hanging on like a stubborn weed. Some peasants were villeins, bound to the land. Others were free tenants, but even they had obligations. Life was a grind, and taxes were another grind on top of that. Henry VIII, for example, was notorious for raising taxes. Because why not? You've got peasants working themselves to the bone anyway, so why not ask for more? The food question for the average peasant was basic, very basic. Most of the diet consisted of bread, coarse rye or barley bread, often supplemented with vegetables, pottage, a thick stew of vegetables and maybe some meat, and occasionally cheese. Meat was rare, except for special occasions or if they were lucky hunters. Dairy was common for those who had livestock. Fish was another staple, especially on days when religious law required no meat. The church had a lot of rules about when you could eat meat, which meant fish was more common than you might expect. Salted or dried fish was stored for lean times. Winter was the hardest season. Food ran out, bread got stale, and stored root vegetables were the only sustenance for many. Starvation wasn't unusual. especially during years of poor harvest, and Tudor England was not immune to famine. Poor harvests, bad weather, and war all hit the countryside hard. Health and hardship. Disease was a constant shadow in peasant life. No sanitation meant frequent outbreaks of illness. Typhoid, dysentery, and plague were common. Smallpox, measles, and tuberculosis were everywhere. Medical knowledge was, well, limited. A lot of treatment was more superstition than science. Herbs, charms, or prayers. Doctors existed, but they were mostly available to the wealthy. Peasants relied on wise women or local healers. Infant mortality was shockingly high. Many children did not live to adulthood. Women faced dangerous childbirths with little help except midwives who sometimes had more folklore than medical skill. Life expectancy for peasants was short, often under 40 years, and that's if you survived childhood and avoided accidents or disease. Religion and the Tudor peasant. Religion was a constant companion. Every village had a church. Sunday Mass wasn't optional. For most peasants, the church was not just a spiritual center, but also a social one, the place to gossip, trade news, and meet neighbors. But Tudor religion was in turmoil. Henry VIII's Reformation in the 1530s changed everything. Suddenly, the Church of England replaced the Catholic Church. Shrines were destroyed, monasteries dissolved, and traditions upended. For peasants, these changes were confusing and often unwelcome. Religion was part of their identity, and the disruption caused unrest. Some peasants resisted. There were uprisings, most famously the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, a rebellion that drew tens of thousands of people protesting Henry's religious changes and high taxes. It was crushed, of course, because that's how Tudor kings rolled. Entertainment, gossip, and escape. Peasants worked hard, but they also had ways to escape. Festivals, markets, and fairs were highlights of the year. Morris dancing, singing, storytelling. These were not just entertainment, but traditions that kept communities together. Storytelling was part of the culture. Tales of saints, local legends, and gossip about the lord or the royal family were passed from mouth to mouth. News traveled slowly, but people loved a bit of drama. Beer was another escape. Ale was part of the daily diet, safer than water, often stronger than what we drink today. Taverns in villages were rare but cherished. They were the center of social life for many peasants. So yes, Tudor peasants lived hard lives. They worked from dawn to dusk. They faced hunger, disease, and the whims of landlords and kings. But they also had community, religion, tradition, and a certain stubborn resilience. Life in Tudor England was not a romantic pastoral idyll. It was mud, toil, prayer, and survival. And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. Not with fanfare or drama, but with the slow, quiet murmur of peasants at the end of a long day. Because if there's one thing a Tudor peasant knew, it's that tomorrow they'd be back in the fields again. So we left off with the simple but grueling rhythm of a Tudor peasant's life. Wake up, work, eat a little, pray a lot, repeat. But that's not the whole picture. Peasants had their own moments of drama. Not the kind of drama you see on Netflix, of course. No cliffhangers, no plot twists. Just the quiet, grinding drama of survival, occasional rebellion, and living under a system designed to keep them in their place. Let's drift back into that world. The weight of taxes and rents. For peasants, life was not just about working the fields. It was also about paying. Rent, taxes, fees, fines.
A peasant might give up half of their harvest to the lord of the manor. Then there were taxes to the crown. The Tudor government loved taxes. Henry VIII, for instance, invented plenty of new ones. Why? Because war is expensive, and Henry liked war almost as much as he liked a new marriage. There were special taxes, too. Sometimes a village might be charged for repairing a bridge, building a road, or contributing to a royal project. If the crown needed money, the burden fell on the peasants, because obviously they had plenty of it. This constant extraction of labor and produce made peasants bitter, but they didn't often have a choice, except, perhaps, to rebel.
The Pilgrimage of Grace.
One of the biggest peasant uprisings of Tudor England happened in 1536. It's called the Pilgrimage of Grace, and it was essentially a mass protest against Henry VIII's religious changes, specifically the dissolution of monasteries and high taxation. Imagine tens of thousands of people walking from the countryside to protest the king's orders. This was not a small village argument over rent. This was huge. And yet, as rebellions go, it ended predictably. Henry VIII was not known for negotiation or mercy. Promises were made, leaders were executed. The uprising was crushed. For peasants, it was a reminder. Protest might feel good, but the cost could be your life. The village calendar. Life for a Tudor peasant revolved around the agricultural calendar, but there was also a calendar of festivals and holy days. These were important. They were breaks in the work, moments to rest, drink, and celebrate. There were saints' days, harvest festivals, and church feasts. These weren't just religious events. They were communal gatherings. You'd have dancing, singing, and plenty of gossip. For a peasant, a festival could be the highlight of the year. But these were also regulated. The church decided which days were holy, and missing them could have consequences. Skipping Mass was frowned upon. Breaking fasting rules could cause scandal. Religion was woven into daily life so tightly that you couldn't separate them, even when you might want to. The small world of the Tudor village. A Tudor village was a small, enclosed world. Everyone knew everyone. News traveled by word of mouth. Gossip was currency. And the life of a village often revolved around its lord. The lord of the manor was not just a landlord. He was the local judge, the tax collector, the enforcer of order. For a peasant, life could be slightly better or far worse, depending on who held that title. Some lords treated their peasants relatively fairly. Others were less fair. Villages were usually self-sufficient. Peasants grew most of their food, made their own clothes, and relied on local craftsmen, blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters. Trade existed, but not at the scale we imagine today. Markets in larger towns offered variety, but for most peasants, the local village was their whole world. Peasant housing and family life. Let's go deeper into housing for a moment. A peasant's home was not the cozy cottage of romantic imagination. It was often dark, damp, and smoky. The walls were wattle and daub, woven wooden sticks plastered with mud. Thatched roofs leaked in bad weather. Floors were bare earth, except for rushes spread to keep the worst of the mud away. Inside, the hearth was everything. It was the kitchen, the heating system, and the light source. Cooking was done over open flames. Smoke curled up through the roof or a simple hole in it. Sleeping arrangements were cramped. The whole family might sleep on straw mattresses in one room. Privacy didn't exist. Children were part of this life from the start. Boys learned the tools of farming. Girls learned household work. Childhood, as we think of it, was short. Peasant children worked from a young age. Play existed, of course, but work was the default mode of life. Clothing and appearance. Clothing for peasants was functional and plain. Wool was the most common material. Linen undergarments might be worn when available. Colors were dull, browns, grays, and muted greens because dyes were expensive. Clothing was patched and mended constantly. Peasants wore what they could afford and repair. A garment might last years. Shoes were simple, often leather, but many peasants went barefoot when they could get away with it. Hairstyles were practical. Women braided or tied their hair. Men kept theirs short for work. Appearance wasn't vanity for peasants. It was survival. Every extra stitch or bit of cloth was an investment. The quiet resilience. Despite the hardship, peasants carried on. They adapted. They created their own small joys. A good harvest meant plenty of bread and ale. A festival meant laughter, even in a hard life. Church gave comfort. Community gave support. And there was a quiet resilience to it all. For centuries, peasants survived under a system designed to keep them underfoot. They survived famine, plague, and war. They survived the whims of lords and kings. And though their lives were hard, they kept living them, quietly, stubbornly, day after day. A moment to pause. So let's pause here. The life of a Tudor peasant was not dramatic in the way history usually tells stories. There were no sweeping victories, no legendary speeches. It was mud, work, prayer, gossip, and survival. But in that quiet life was a story worth telling. A story of endurance, of living with little and making the most of it. And that, in a way, is the core of Tudor peasantry. Not glory, not revolution, just life.
Let's continue drifting through the mud of Tudor life. We've already looked at the grind of work, the weight of taxes, the rhythm of the seasons. Now let's slow it down even more and look at the little details that shaped a peasant's world. The churchyard, the village gossip, personal tragedies, and the small rebellions that never made the history books. The parish as the heart of the village. For the Tudor peasant, the parish church was not just a place of worship, it was the hub of village life. The churchyard was where births, marriages, and deaths were recorded. It was where people gathered, not only for Mass, but for news and social life. Church attendance was expected. Missing it without a good excuse could result in fines. And the vicar was a powerful figure. More than a priest, he was a moral authority, a recorder of events, and often a mediator in disputes. Church was also the peasant's calendar. Saints' days, fast days, holy days, these structured life. They were moments of pause in the otherwise unending cycle of work. Parish records are windows into ordinary lives. These little ledgers often reveal lives otherwise invisible. They list baptisms, marriages, burials. They sometimes note unusual events, like a plague outbreak, a theft, an unusual weather pattern. For example, in some villages you'll find notes like, John, son of Thomas, buried, age 4 weeks, plague suspected, or Margaret fined for not attending Mass. These entries aren't dramatic in themselves, but together they form a quiet mosaic of life. Births, deaths, small complaints, acts of charity, moments of joy and grief. Marriage and family life. Marriage for peasants was practical. Love existed, of course, but survival was the priority. Marriages were arrangements that kept land, labor, and resources in the family.
Weddings were often modest, though some might involve a feast paid for by the whole village. Families were large, partly because children were needed for labor, partly because infant mortality was high. Children were a vital part of the workforce. They learned farming and domestic skills early. Childhood was brief. By the age of 8 or 9, many children were already working full-time. The home was a shared space for life and death. Death came early and often. Funerals were community events. Bodies were buried in the churchyard, often without markers. Life in Tudor England was marked by cycles of labor, prayer, and passing away. Religion in daily life. Religion wasn't just a Sunday thing. It was woven into every day. Morning prayers, blessings before meals, holy days, fasts, festivals. The Tudor peasant lived in a religious rhythm. Henry VIII's break with Rome changed some of this. The dissolution of the monasteries not only removed religious centers, but also charitable ones. Monasteries had been places where the poor could receive food, care, or shelter. Their loss was felt deeply in rural communities. For the peasant, these changes were confusing. Religious instruction came from the church, and sometimes that instruction shifted dramatically depending on who was in power. It wasn't just theology, it was the lived reality of shifting beliefs. Personal stories from the parish. Let's slow down to some small stories. Parish records preserve names, dates, and a hint of a life. There's the case of Joan from a small village in Yorkshire, recorded as fined for overstaying the Mass because she lingered too long chatting after church. Not exactly rebellion, but a moment of human desire for community over regulation. Then there's Thomas, a peasant, fined for poaching rabbits. Meat was precious, poaching was survival, and Thomas probably knew the risks, but hunger beats obedience. These small defiance moments didn't change history, but they were acts of quiet resistance. They were the murmurs of lives lived under a system that demanded compliance. Festivals, fairs, and rituals. The Tudor calendar was dotted with festivals. There was May Day with dancing and singing. There was Lammas Day, marking the harvest. Saints' days dotted the year like quiet punctuation marks in the slow story of rural life. Festivals were breaks from labor. There were moments of celebration, gossip, and indulgence. Ale flowed, dancing happened, stories were told. And for the peasants, it was an escape, even if only for a day. The fairs, too, were important. They brought goods from further afield, allowed trade, and gave peasants access to items they wouldn't normally have. Fairs could be rowdy, full of music and drink. They were part commerce, part celebration, part spectacle. Small revolts and everyday resistance. Not every rebellion made the history books. For peasants, resistance was often subtle. Refusing to work extra days for the Lord, quietly ignoring a fine, poaching rabbits, hiding food, selling goods in secret. These small acts didn't make headlines, but they were ways peasants maintained control in a world designed to take it away. Resistance wasn't grand, it was survival. And survival was the Tudor peasant's quiet form of rebellion. The quiet end of a day. A peasant's day ended as it began, slowly, quietly. The hearth was cleaned, supper eaten. Stories might be told, prayers said. The household settled into sleep. Outside, the village was silent, except for the occasional barking dog or the creak of a cartwheel. Tomorrow would bring the same cycle: mud, work, prayer, and survival. And that was life. Not glorious, not dramatic, just life. Let's drift back into the quiet, slow world of the Tudor peasant. We've been talking about rhythm, work, church, festivals, gossip, survival. Now let's slow down further and look at the moments when life was disturbed: famine, punishment, and the subtle changes that began eroding centuries of tradition. Years of hunger. The Tudor countryside was not always able to feed itself. Bad harvests happened. Sometimes they happened several years in a row. Weather was unpredictable. Too much rain could rot the grain. Too little rain could starve it. And a single bad harvest could mean famine. Famine years were slow disasters. Food became scarce. Prices rose. Bread became coarse, sometimes cut with straw or beans to make it stretch further. Starvation was common, and hunger made people desperate. Theft, poaching, and selling goods on the sly became more frequent. Records from Tudor villages occasionally note these years. Parish registers sometimes list an unusual number of burials in a single year, silent evidence of famine. But there were no dramatic uprisings, just quiet suffering, day after day. Hunger shaped the life of the Tudor peasant. It dictated labor, forced compromises, and shaped relationships between families, villages, and lords. Law and order in the village. For peasants, the law was not an abstract idea. It was something enforced locally, often by the lord of the manor or the village constable. Justice was personal. It happened in the manor court. Decisions were made quickly. Punishments were public. Crimes included obvious things: theft, poaching, violence, but also breaking village rules, neglecting obligations, or missing church services. Punishments could be fines, whipping, or time in the stocks. Public humiliation was part of the deterrent. Stocks were not just punishment, they were theater. Neighbors would gather, gossip, and jeer. Law was not blind, it was personal and local. A peasant's fate could depend on their relationship with the Lord or the mood of the village constable. Justice was part of village life, not separate from it. Fines, fees, and the burden of obligation. The feudal system of the Tudor countryside meant peasants owed more than labor. They owed money and produce. There were fines for late work, fees for using common land, charges for grinding grain at the lord's mill. Every action could be taxed. And lords of manors were rarely charitable. These fines and fees were a steady source of income for them. For peasants, they were a constant reminder that they were not the owners of their lives. It was a subtle form of control. Work was not just a necessity, it was an obligation woven into a system that left little room for escape. Changing times. Tudor modernization. By the late Tudor period, life in the countryside was slowly changing. Enclosure, the process of converting common land into private property, began to alter the traditional way of life. Peasants who once had access to common pastures found themselves excluded. Enclosure could mean eviction. It could mean loss of grazing land. For many, it meant the end of a centuries-old way of life. Some moved to towns. Others tried to adapt. But the change was profound. This was part of a larger trend. Tudor England was moving towards a more modern economy. More trade, more regulation, more centralized control. For peasants, it was not an exciting revolution. It was a slow erasure of the world they knew. Personal stories of change. In some villages, records show petitions from peasants complaining about enclosure. These weren't grand political declarations. They were humble pleas. We beg to retain access to the common pasture, so our animals may not starve. Sometimes they succeeded. Often they did not. Lords have the law and the crown behind them. And so the peasant world shifted quietly. The change was not marked by violence or upheaval, but by slow erosion, by small losses that added up to something bigger. The Tudor peasant's life was becoming something else entirely. Not exactly modern life, but no longer the old rural life that had existed for centuries.
Religion and change. Religion, too, was part of this change. The Reformation altered not just worship, but the social fabric. Churches became Protestant. Monasteries disappeared. Pilgrimages ended. The ritual landscape of the countryside was altered. For the peasant, this was disorienting. Faith had been part of everyday life, a constant, steady rhythm. Now it was something uncertain. Religious change was imposed from above, and acceptance varied.
A reflection. And so we end this part with a thought. The Tudor peasant's life was not dramatic. It was not glorious. It was slow, quiet, and full of endurance. It was mud and toil, prayer and story, work and small acts of defiance. It was a life shaped by seasons and obligation, by hunger and hardship, by faith and tradition. And perhaps the truest mark of that life is that, even as the world changed, the peasant found ways to keep living. By the late Tudor period, the late 1500s, moving into the early 1600s, the peasant world was quietly transforming. Nothing dramatic, no sweeping revolutions, just a slow reshaping of life under the weight of economics, religion, and change. For peasants, change was like the weather, sometimes noticeable, sometimes imperceptible. But over decades, it became undeniable. Enclosure and its consequences. By now, enclosure was spreading across England. Land that once had been common, open to grazing, foraging, and cultivation, was being fenced off. Lords saw it as a way to increase profits, often through sheep farming. For peasants, enclosure was a quiet disaster. Loss of common land meant loss of grazing rights, loss of fuel sources, loss of freedom. It meant evictions. It meant moving to unfamiliar villages. It meant losing the small independence they had left. Enclosure wasn't violent in most cases. It was bureaucratic, legal, done with little ceremony. But it was devastating for rural life. By the end of the Tudor era, enclosure was one of the quiet forces erasing the old peasant world. The late Tudor village. The village in the late Tudor period still lived by its traditions, but those traditions were under pressure. The festivals were fewer. The land was changing. The obligations to lords were heavier. Yet village life retained something of its character. Gossip still mattered. Storytelling still happened at the hearth. The church still shaped the rhythm of life. For the average peasant, the day remained much the same. Rise before dawn, work the land, attend church, tend the animals, eat, sleep, repeat. But the background was shifting. Stories from parish records. We return to parish records for a moment. They tell us of the quiet changes in village life. In one village in Norfolk, there was a note, "Margery fined for gathering rushes without leave, October 1592. Rushes were used to cover floors. Gathering them without permission shows both the need of the poor and the control of the lord." In another record, Thomas of East Haddon buried, age 72, January 1599. He hath lived here all his days. That's a quiet story. No drama, no rebellion. Just a life lived entirely in one village, a testament to the persistence of tradition.
A village in memory. By the close of the Tudor period, The peasant village was both the same and not the same. The fields were still plowed. The church still stood at the center. The hearth still gathered families. But the world outside the village was changing. Trade was growing. Towns were expanding. The country was moving toward something modern. The old rhythms of peasant life were fading. And yet, for those who lived in the village, life remained slow. It remained rooted in tradition, community, and endurance. A quiet end to the Tudor peasant story. So we end this part where we began, with the slow, quiet life of the Tudor peasant. No great battles, no sudden revolutions, just centuries of endurance lived day by day. Life in the Tudor countryside was not dramatic. It was mud and work, prayer and story, obligation and quiet defiance. It was survival. And survival was, in its own way, a kind of quiet victory. So here we are. We've wandered slowly through the life of the Tudor peasant, from the smell of the hearth to the grind of the fields, from small acts of defiance to the quiet disappearance of the old ways. It's late now. The day has passed, or rather, many days have passed. We've traveled across centuries without leaving our chairs, and in doing so, we've been in the company of those who lived quietly under the weight of centuries-old obligation. The end of an era. By the end of the Tudor period, the world of the peasant had already begun to vanish. Enclosure, religious reform, the growth of towns, these were not dramatic battles but slow changes. The Tudor peasant world did not end in a blaze of glory. It faded, quietly. The village life, with its rituals, obligations, festivals, and gossip, was giving way to something different. The rhythm of life was changing. Work would become organized differently. The land would be owned differently. The quiet endurance of the peasant way of life would slip into memory. And yet, in that slow fading, there was something worth remembering. The legacy of the Tudor peasant. The Tudor peasant's life was not written in history books with bold letters. It was not marked by conquest or fame. It was recorded in parish registers, in quiet traditions, in the memory of villages. It was a life of endurance, of ritual, of quiet resistance, of working without end, and of community. That is the legacy of the Tudor peasant, the persistence of a way of life in the face of change, and the survival of small traditions in a changing world. The quietness of history. There's something about the Tudor peasant story that fits well with the night. No loud drama, no sudden revelations, just a slow story drifting like smoke over a hearth. History is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is the story of work and prayer, of seasons passing, of lives lived in mud and memory. That is the story of the Tudor peasant. A gentle farewell. So tonight, as you settle into bed, perhaps with the lights dimmed, a day behind you, remember that the Tudor peasant lived in a world not unlike ours in one way, a world defined by survival. They lived without certainty, without comfort, and yet they lived. They endured. They kept their traditions alive. They told their stories, and they passed their lives quietly into history. And so let us leave them there, in the quiet of their village, by the hearth, with the night falling outside, because that is where their story belongs, not in triumph or tragedy, but in quiet endurance. Good night.